They say blood is thicker than water, but in my family, blood is just another currency. The night before I was supposed to tie my life to the daughter of a rival shipping magnate, I decided to play a game. I wanted to see if my brothers loved me, or if they were just waiting for my pulse to stop so they could split my shares. I staged my own disappearance, a prank involving a fake ransom note and a dark room. But as I sat behind the two-way glass, waiting for the panic to set in, I heard something that stopped my heart. My brothers weren't calling the police. They were laughing. And then Silas pulled out a pre-signed death certificate with my name on it. Before we uncover the cold-blooded reality of what happens when a prank goes lethal, welcome to the channel. This is the home of the high-stakes elite. If you're fascinated by the secrets kept behind closed boardroom doors, hit that like button and subscribe. Also, we want to hear from you. Drop a comment and tell us where in the world you are watching from today. Now, as the realization sank in that the men I grew up with had been planning my funeral while I was planning my wedding, the game took a turn I never prepared for. Julian Hargrove had not slept in 47 hours. The insomnia was not the result of nerves or excitement, though anyone who saw the headlines plastered across the financial news would assume otherwise. Hargrove, heir to wed Ashcroft heiress in union of maritime empires, read the Financial Times. $1 billion marriage, declared Bloomberg. The tabloids were less restrained. The wedding of the decade, when old money meets older money. But Julian was not awake because of the wedding. He was awake because his father's voice still echoed in his skull, even 3 years after the old man's funeral. Trust no one, not your mother, not your brothers, and especially not yourself when you're in love. Julian sat in the library of the Hargrove family's primary estate in Newport, Rhode Island. The room smelled of aged leather and cigar smoke that had seeped into the mahogany walls over 120 years. Outside, the October wind rattled the tall windows that overlooked the Atlantic. The ocean was black tonight, churning under a moonless sky. He held a tumbler of Macallan 1926, a 60-year Scotch that his father had purchased at auction for $1.9 million. Julian could taste the peat and oak, the faint sweetness that came from decades in a sherry cask. He did not enjoy it. He drank it because it had been his father's, and because tomorrow he would sign papers that would merge Hargrove Shipping with Ashcroft Maritime, creating the largest privately owned shipping conglomerate in the Western Hemisphere. The ring sat on the table in front of him. 22 carats, emerald-cut diamond set in platinum. It had belonged to his grandmother, who had worn it until the day she died at 93, still sharp as a blade and twice as cold. The ring was worth $4.7 million, though that figure was irrelevant. What mattered was what it represented. Continuity, legacy, the unbroken chain of wealth and power that stretched back to 1847, when the first Hargrove had built a clipper ship and sailed it to Shanghai. Julian was 34 years old. He had an MBA from Wharton and a law degree from Yale that he had never used. He spoke 4 languages fluently and could navigate the politics of a boardroom in Hong Kong, London, or Dubai with equal ease. He had been groomed for this role since birth, trained to see the world not as it was, but as a series of acquisitions, mergers, and strategic alliances. And Isabel Ashcroft was the most strategic alliance he would ever make. She was beautiful, in the way that old money produced beauty, tall, slender, with blonde hair that fell in a perfect sheet down her back and blue eyes that never seemed to blink. She had been educated at La Rosey in Switzerland, summered in the Hamptons, and spoke with the kind of cultivated accent that erased any trace of geography. She was 28, poised, and utterly bloodless. Julian had proposed to her 6 months ago at her family's estate in the Berkshires. They had been standing on a terrace overlooking a man-made lake, and he had knelt on the flagstones that were still warm from the afternoon sun. She had said yes before he had finished the question, and when he slipped the ring onto her finger, she had smiled with her mouth, but not her eyes. They had not slept together, not once. There was an unspoken understanding that their marriage would be consummated on the wedding night, as tradition dictated, but until then, they maintained separate residences. Julian lived in the Newport estate. Isabel lived in a penthouse on Fifth Avenue that overlooked Central Park. One, he did not love her. He was not sure she loved him. But love was not part of the equation. What mattered was the shipping routes, the combined fleet of container ships and oil tankers, the port access in Singapore and Rotterdam, the offshore accounts and the tax shelters, and the influence that came with controlling 17% of the transatlantic freight market. Julian set the tumbler down and stood. The library was silent, except for the ticking of a grandfather clock that had been built in 1889. He walked to the window and looked out at the ocean. The estate sat on 11 acres of cliffside property, surrounded by a 12-foot stone wall, and monitored by a security system that included motion sensors, infrared cameras, and a team of 6 armed guards who rotated shifts. He had grown up in this house. So had his brothers. Reed was 31, 3 years younger than Julian, and had been named Chief Operating Officer of Hargrove Shipping 2 years ago. He was shorter than Julian, stockier, with dark hair that he kept slicked back and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. Reed had married a woman named Charlotte, a pale, nervous creature who rarely spoke and spent most of her time at their townhouse in Boston. They had no children. Reed drank too much and had a habit of making expensive mistakes, a failed investment in a Panamanian port, a legal settlement with a labor union that Julian had quietly cleaned up. Silas was 28, the youngest and the most dangerous. He was tall, lean, with the same sharp cheekbones and grey eyes as Julian, but where Julian had learned to mask his ambition behind a veneer of civility, Silas had never bothered. He was vice president of acquisitions, a role that gave him access to every financial transaction the company made. He was unmarried, though he kept a rotating cast of models and actresses in a loft in Tribeca. He drove a Lamborghini Aventador and wore custom suits from Savile Row, and had once, at a charity gala, told a journalist that he did not believe in philanthropy because the poor will always be poor. Julian had not trusted his brothers in years, but he had never imagined they would want him dead. The idea for the prank had come to him 3 weeks ago, during a dinner at the Union Club in Manhattan. He had been sitting with Reed and Silas, discussing the final terms of the merger. Isabel had been there too, sipping champagne and saying little. The conversation had turned to the wedding, and Silas had made a joke, offhand, casual, about how Julian's bachelor days were numbered. "Enjoy your freedom while it lasts," Silas had said, grinning. "Once you sign those papers, you're locked in for life." Reed had laughed. "Unless something happens to you before the wedding." The comment had hung in the air for a moment too long. Julian had looked at Reed, then at Silas, and had seen something flicker in their expressions, something cold and calculating. He had dismissed it at the time, but the thought had lingered, growing in the back of his mind like a slow-growing tumor. And so he had decided to test them. The plan was simple. He would stage his own disappearance the night before the wedding. He would leave a ransom note, cryptic and threatening, and make it look like he had been taken. Then he would watch, from a hidden room in the estate, asked to see how his brothers reacted. Would they panic? Would they call the police? Would they do everything in their power to bring him back? Or would they see an opportunity? Julian had spent the last 3 weeks preparing. He had installed hidden cameras in his office, in the boardroom, and in the estate's main living areas. He had hired a private security consultant, a former CIA operative named Frank Dalton, to help him set up the surveillance system. Dalton had asked no questions, had simply done the work, and accepted the $200,000 payment in cash. Julian had written the ransom note himself, on a typewriter he had purchased from an antique shop in Providence. The note was brief, vague, and untraceable. "We have him. If you want him back, do not contact the authorities. Wait for further instructions." He had planned to leave the note in his office, then disappear to a hidden room in the estate's east wing, a panic room that had been built during the Cold War, back when his grandfather had been convinced that nuclear war was imminent. The room was soundproof, climate-controlled, and equipped with monitors that would allow him to watch every camera feed in real time. Tomorrow was the wedding. Tonight was the test. Julian checked his watch. It was 11:43 p.m. Reed and Silas were staying at the estate for the weekend, along with a handful of other family members and close friends who had arrived early for the ceremony. Julian had told them he was going for a walk along the cliffs, that he needed to clear his head before the big day. He had left his phone in his bedroom, deliberately, and to make the disappearance seem more convincing. He finished the scotch, set the glass down, and walked out of the library. The hallway was dimly lit, the walls lined with portraits of dead Hargroves. His great-great-grandfather, stern and bearded, staring down from an oil painting. His grandmother, regal in pearls and a fur stole. His father, unsmiling, holding a model ship. Julian did not look at them. He walked through the house, past the grand staircase, past the ballroom where the wedding reception would be held, and down a narrow corridor that led to the servants' quarters. At the end of the corridor was a door that looked like it led to a broom closet. Julian opened it, stepped inside, and closed the door behind him. The panic room was small, maybe 10 feet by 12, with concrete walls and a steel door. There was a desk with 3 monitors, a chair, a small refrigerator stocked with water and protein bars, and a cot in the corner. Julian sat down at the desk and turned on the monitors. The screens flickered to life, showing camera feeds from around the estate, the office, the boardroom, the living room, the main entrance. He opened a drawer and pulled out the ransom note, sealed in a plain, white envelope. He had already arranged for it to be delivered to Reed's room at midnight, slipped under the door by one of the staff members he had paid to do it without asking questions. Julian leaned back in the chair and waited. The note was delivered at 12:04 a.m. Julian watched on the monitor as a young woman in a housekeeping uniform approached Reed's door, bent down, and slid the envelope underneath. She straightened, glanced around nervously, and then hurried away. 3 minutes passed, then the door opened. Reed stood in the doorway, wearing a white undershirt and pajama pants. His hair was disheveled, his face heavy with sleep. He looked down at the envelope, frowned, and picked it up. Julian leaned closer to the monitor, his pulse quickening. Reed tore open the envelope and read the note. His expression did not change. He stood there for a long moment, the paper in his hand, and then he turned and walked back into his room. Julian switched to the camera feed inside Reed's room. It was a guest suite on the second floor, decorated in muted blues and grays with a four-poster bed and a view of the gardens. Reed sat down on the edge of the bed and pulled out his phone. Julian's breath caught. This was it. Reed was going to call the police, or their head of security. Reed dialed a number and held the phone to his ear. "Silas," he said, his voice calm. "Get up here, now." Julian switched to the hallway camera and watched as Silas emerged from his room 2 doors down. He was shirtless, wearing only a pair of black boxer briefs, and he looked irritated. "This better be good," Silas muttered as he walked into Reed's room. Reed handed him the note without a word. Silas read it, his brow furrowing. Then he looked up at Reed, and a slow smile spread across his face. "Well," Silas said, "this is unexpected." Reed stood and walked to the window, his back to Silas. "Do you think it's real? Does it matter?" Reed turned. "What are you talking about?" Silas folded the note and tossed it onto the bed. "Think about it, Reed. Julian disappears the night before his wedding. No body, no witnesses. Just a vague ransom note. So maybe whoever took him isn't planning to give him back." Reed's expression hardened. "What are you suggesting?" Silas walked to the minibar in the corner of the room and poured himself a glass of bourbon. He took a long drink, then set the glass down. "I'm suggesting that we don't call the police. Not yet." "Why the hell not?" "Because if Julian is dead," Silas said, turning to face his brother, "the company is ours." Julian's hands clenched into fists. Reed stared at Silas, his face unreadable. "You're insane." "Am I?" Silas crossed his arms. "Julian gets married tomorrow, and the second he signs those merger papers, he controls 83% of Hargrove shipping. You and I get scraps. But if he's gone, if he's declared dead, his shares get divided equally between us, 41.5% each. We become the majority shareholders." "Jesus Christ, Silas. Don't act so shocked." Silas's voice was cold. "You've been skimming off the company for 2 years. Don't think I don't know about the offshore accounts in the Caymans or the shell corporations you set up in Delaware. You've been bleeding the company dry, and the only reason Julian hasn't noticed is because he's been too busy playing house with Isabel." Reed's face went pale. "How do you—" "I know everything, Reed. I'm vice president of acquisitions. It's my job to know where the money goes." Silas picked up his glass and drained it. "And here's the thing. I've been doing the same." Julian felt the floor drop out from under him. "You've been embezzling?" Reed's voice was barely a whisper. "For 3 years," Silas said. Small amounts at first. A few $100,000 here, $1 million there. Buried in consulting fees, legal settlements, offshore investments. Julian never checks the details. He trusts us to handle it." Reed sank into a chair, his head in his hands. "How much?" "Combined? About 67 million. The number hung in the air like a guillotine blade. "If Julian finds out—" "He won't," Silas said, "because he's gone. And if we play this right, he stays gone." Julian's vision blurred. He gripped the edge of the desk, his breath coming in shallow gasps. This was not a test anymore. This was real. Reed looked up at Silas. "What are you proposing?" Silas walked to the bed and sat down. He reached into the drawer of the nightstand and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He unfolded it and held it up. Julian's blood turned to ice. It was a death certificate, his death certificate, pre-signed by a doctor whose name Julian did not recognize, dated 2 days from now. The cause of death was listed as accidental drowning. "Where did you get that?" Reed's voice was hoarse. "I had it made 6 months ago," Silas said. "Right after Julian announced the engagement. I knew that once he married Isabel, we'd be out of the picture. So I started planning." "Planning what?" Silas smiled. "An accident, something clean, untraceable, a boating trip maybe, or a fall from the cliffs. I hadn't decided yet, but this," he gestured to the ransom note, "this is even better. Julian disappears, presumed dead. We wait a few weeks, file the death certificate, and collect our inheritance." Reed stood, his face twisted with disgust. "Or you're talking about murdering our brother?" "I'm talking about survival," Silas said. "We've already stolen $67 million from him, Reed. If he finds out, we go to prison. Do you want to spend the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary? Because I sure as hell don't." Reed paced the room, his hands shaking. "This is insane. We can't." "We can," Silas said, "and we will, because the alternative is losing everything." Julian watched, his entire body numb. He wanted to scream, to tear down the walls, to confront them. But he forced himself to stay still, to keep watching. Reed stopped pacing and looked at Silas. "What about Isabel?" Silas's smile widened. "Isabel is already on board." Julian's heart stopped. What? You think I'd plan something like this without insurance?" Silas pulled out his phone and tapped the screen. A moment later, a voice filled the room, a recording. It was Isabel's voice, cool and detached. "So it's done?" "Almost," Silas's voice replied. "The wedding is tomorrow. After that, it's just a matter of timing." "And you're sure he won't suspect anything?" "Julian is too busy thinking about the merger to notice what's happening under his nose. He trusts me, he trusts Reed, and he trusts you." Isabel laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "He shouldn't." The recording ended. Reed stared at Silas, his face ashen. "She's been in on this the whole time?" "Since the beginning," Silas said. "Why do you think she agreed to marry him? Julian is a means to an end. Once he's gone, she gets his estate, and she splits it with us, on 33% each." Julian could not breathe. Reed sat down heavily. "What do we do now?" Silas stood and walked to the door. "We do nothing. We let whoever took Julian finish the job, and if they don't," he paused, his hand on the doorknob, "we finish it ourselves." He left the room, and Reed sat alone in the silence. Julian stared at the monitor, his mind racing. Everything he had believed, everything he had trusted, was a lie. His brothers had been stealing from him for years. His fiancée had never loved him. And now, they were planning to kill him. He had staged this prank to test their loyalty. Instead, he had uncovered a conspiracy that went far deeper than he had ever imagined. But there was one thing they did not know. Julian was still alive, and he was still in control. Julian sat in the panic room for 3 hours, and watching the monitors and making notes. His brothers had gone back to their rooms. The estate was silent. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the windows and sending sheets of rain across the cliffs. He had recorded everything, every word, every gesture, every damning confession. The audio was saved on a secure server, encrypted and backed up to 3 separate locations. But the recordings alone were not enough. If he confronted his brothers now, they would deny everything. Silas would destroy the death certificate. Reed would claim the offshore accounts were legitimate business expenses. And Isabel, Julian's jaw tightened. Isabel would smile and lie, the way she had been lying since the day they met. Confrontation was not the answer. If Julian wanted to win this, he needed to do more than expose them. He needed to dismantle them. He opened his laptop and logged into the company's financial system. He had access to everything: the ledgers, the account numbers, the transaction histories. It took him 20 minutes to find the offshore accounts Reed had been using. They were buried under layers of shell corporations, but the paper trail was there if you knew where to look. Julian copied the account numbers and transferred them to a secure file. Then he started digging into Silas's records. Silas had been more careful. His embezzlement was spread across a dozen different accounts, hidden in consulting fees and legal settlements. But Julian had spent his entire life studying financial systems, and he knew how to follow the money. By the time the sun began to rise, he had traced every stolen dollar. 67 million. Silas had not been exaggerating. Julian leaned back in the chair, his eyes burning from lack of sleep. He had the evidence. Now he needed a plan. The wedding was supposed to take place at 4 p.m. in the estate's gardens, overlooking the ocean. 200 guests were expected, including members of both families, business associates, politicians, and journalists. The ceremony would be followed by a reception in the ballroom with a 9-course dinner and a performance by a string quartet flown in from Vienna. Julian had no intention of letting any of that happen. Instead, he would use his disappearance to his advantage. As far as Reed, Silas, and Isabel knew, Julian was either dead or in the hands of kidnappers. They would not expect him to reappear, and that gave him the element of surprise. But first, he needed to deal with the money. Julian logged into the offshore accounts Reed had been using and initiated a series of wire transfers. He moved the stolen funds out of the Cayman accounts and into a holding account he had set up years ago, one that only he had access to. Then he did the same with Silas's accounts, draining them systematically. By the time he was finished, every dollar they had stolen was back under his control. Next, he turned his attention to Isabel. Isabel's finances were more complicated. She had her own trust fund, inherited from her grandmother, worth approximately $300 million. But Julian knew that the trust was structured in a way that gave her limited access to the principal. She received an annual allowance of $5 million, but the bulk of the money was locked up until she turned 40 or got married, which meant that marrying Julian was not just about the merger. It was about unlocking her trust fund. Julian opened a new browser window and logged into the family's legal database. It took him an hour to find what he was looking for: the prenuptial agreement that Isabel's lawyers had drafted 6 months ago. The agreement was heavily weighted in her favor. In the event of a divorce, Isabel would receive 50% of Julian's personal assets, along with full control of her trust fund. But there was a clause that most people would overlook, a small paragraph buried on page 17. In the event of the groom's death, prior to the consummation of the marriage, the agreement shall be rendered null and void, and all assets shall revert to the groom's estate. Julian smiled for the first time in hours. If he died before the wedding night, Isabel would get nothing, which meant that she needed him alive long enough to consummate the marriage. And then Julian's smile faded, and then she would kill him. He closed the laptop and stood. The panic room felt smaller than it had a few hours ago, the walls pressing in. He needed to move, to act, to take control of the situation before it spiraled any further. He checked the monitors one last time. The estate was quiet. Reed and Silas were still in their rooms. The staff was beginning to prepare for the wedding, setting up chairs in the garden and arranging flowers in the ballroom. Julian opened the steel door and stepped into the corridor. The air was cool and smelled of rain. He walked through the servants' quarters and into the main house, moving silently. He needed to talk to Frank Dalton. Frank Dalton was staying in a cottage at the edge of the estate, a small stone building that had once been used to house the groundskeeper. Julian had arranged for him to stay there during the wedding weekend, ostensibly to oversee security. But Dalton's real job was to monitor the surveillance feeds and ensure that Julian's plan went off without a hitch. Julian knocked on the cottage door at 6:30 a.m. The sky was grey and overcast, the rain still falling in a steady drizzle. After a moment, the door opened. Dalton was in his early 50s, with short-cropped grey hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. He was wearing a black t-shirt and jeans, and his eyes were sharp and alert despite the early hour. "You're supposed to be kidnapped," Dalton said, stepping aside to let Julian in. "Plans have changed." The cottage was Spartan, furnished with a single bed, a desk, and a chair. A laptop sat open on the desk, showing the same camera feeds that Julian had been watching in the panic room. Julian sat down and told Dalton everything. He spoke quickly, efficiently, laying out the details of what he had overheard and what he had discovered. Dalton listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When Julian finished, Dalton leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. "So, your brothers are embezzling, your fiancée is a gold digger, and they're all planning to kill you. That about sums it up." Dalton was silent for a moment. Then he said, What do you want to do about it?" "I want to destroy them." "Legally?" Julian met his gaze. "Preferably, but I'm open to alternatives." Dalton stood and walked to the window, looking out at the rain-soaked grounds. "If you go public with this, it's going to get messy. Your brothers will lawyer up. Isabel will deny everything. And even if you have recordings, a good defense attorney can argue that they were taken illegally." "I don't care about the recordings," Julian said. "I care about the money. I've already transferred everything they stole back into accounts they can't access. By the time they realize what's happened, they'll be broke." Dalton turned. "And Isabel?" "Isabel gets nothing. The prenup is void if I die before the marriage is consummated, which means she needs me alive long enough to go through with the wedding. But I'm not giving her that chance." "So, you cancel the wedding?" "No," Julian said. "I let the wedding happen, but I don't show up as the groom." Dalton raised an eyebrow. "Explain." Julian stood and walked to the desk, pulling up a file on the laptop. It was a scanned copy of the death certificate Silas had shown Reed, along with a list of names and addresses. "This death certificate was signed by a Dr. Nathaniel Crane," Julian said. "He's a licensed physician, but he's also been under investigation by the medical board for falsifying records. 3 months ago, he was caught signing off on disability claims for people who weren't actually disabled. He's facing a suspension, maybe worse. So he's dirty." "Very, and Silas paid him $50,000 to pre-sign this certificate. I found the transaction in Silas's accounts." Dalton studied the screen. "If you can prove that, you can get Silas arrested for conspiracy to commit fraud, maybe even attempted murder, depending on how the DA wants to spin it." "That's the plan," Julian said. "But I need to time it right. If I go to the authorities now, Silas and Reed will disappear. Isabel will claim she had no idea what was happening. They'll scatter, and I'll spend the next 5 years in court trying to prove my case. So, you wait until the wedding. Exactly. I let them think I'm dead. I let them show up to the wedding, expecting to play the role of grieving family members. And then, in front of 200 witnesses, I walk in and present the evidence. Dalton was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded. It's risky, but it could work. I need your help, Julian said. I need you to contact the FBI, quietly. Tell them I have evidence of embezzlement and fraud, and that I'm willing to cooperate. But I need them to be ready to move the second I give the word. I can do that. And I need you to keep monitoring the cameras. If Reed or Silas make a move, if they try to leave the estate or contact anyone outside, I need to know immediately. Understood. Julian stood and walked to the door. He paused, his hand on the doorknob, and looked back at Dalton. One more thing, he said. If this goes wrong, if they figure out I'm still alive before I'm ready, I need you to make sure the recordings get to the authorities, no matter what. Dalton met his gaze. It won't come to that. But if it does, I'll make sure the recordings get out, Dalton said. You have my word. Julian nodded and left the cottage. The wedding was scheduled to begin at 4 p.m., but by noon, the estate was already in chaos. Julian watched from the panic room as staff members ran back and forth, carrying flowers and linens and trays of champagne glasses. In the garden, workers were setting up rows of white chairs beneath a canvas canopy. The rain had stopped, but the sky was still overcast, and the air smelled of wet grass and salt. At 1 p.m., Isabel arrived. Julian watched her step out of a black Mercedes sedan, wearing a long white coat over her dress. Her hair was pulled back in an elegant chignon, and she wore sunglasses despite the lack of sun. She moved with the kind of grace that came from years of finishing school and etiquette lessons, her heels clicking against the stone driveway. She was met at the door by Reed, who kissed her on both cheeks and said something that Julian could not hear. Isabel smiled, a cold, perfect smile, and followed him into the house. Julian switched to the camera in the main living room. Isabel and Reed were standing near the fireplace, speaking in low voices. "Have you heard anything?" Isabel asked. "Nothing," Reed said. "No calls, no demands. Whoever took him is staying silent." "Good," Reed frowned. "Good?" Isabel removed her sunglasses and looked at him. "The longer Julian is gone, the easier this gets. If he shows up now, we have a problem. But if he's still missing by the time the wedding is supposed to start..." "We cancel," Reed said. "We tell the guests there's been an emergency, and we reschedule." "Or," Isabel said, her voice cool, "or we declare him dead and move on." Reed stared at her. "You're serious." "Why wouldn't I be? The death certificate is ready. All we need is a plausible explanation. A boating accident, a fall from the cliffs, it doesn't matter. The point is, Julian is gone, and we can finally stop pretending." Reed looked away. "This wasn't supposed to happen like this." "Life rarely goes according to plan," Isabel said. She placed a hand on his arm, her touch light and deliberate. "But we're going to be fine, Reed. You, me, and Silas. We're going to walk away from this with everything we ever wanted." Julian's hands shook as he watched the screen. He had known Isabel was involved, but hearing her speak so casually about his death, about wanting him gone, was something else entirely. At 2:30, the guests began to arrive. Julian watched them file into the estate, dressed in their finest. Senators, CEOs, members of both families. They mingled in the ballroom, drinking champagne and making polite conversation, unaware that the groom was missing. At 3:15, Reed called for a family meeting in the study. Julian switched to the camera in the study and watched as Reed, Silas, and Isabel gathered around the massive oak desk that had belonged to Julian's grandfather. The room smelled of pipe tobacco and old books, and the walls were lined with shelves that held first editions of Melville and Conrad. "We have a problem," Reed said. "The wedding is supposed to start in 45 minutes, and Julian is still missing." "So we cancel," Silas said. He was leaning against the desk, his arms crossed. "Tell the guests there's been a family emergency, and send them home." "And then what?" Reed asked. "We just wait for Julian to turn up." "Or we don't," Silas said. He pulled out the death certificate and laid it on the desk. "We file this. We tell the authorities that Julian went for a walk last night and never came back. Search teams find his body washed up on the rocks below the cliffs. Accidental drowning. Case closed." Isabel studied the certificate, her expression unreadable. "It's risky. If anyone questions it—" "No one will," Silas said. "Dr. Crane signed off on it. The coroner will rubber stamp it, and by the time anyone thinks to ask questions, we'll already have control of the company." Reed rubbed his face with both hands. "I don't know if I can go through with this." "You don't have a choice," Silas said. "We've already crossed the line, Reed. There's no going back." Isabel picked up the death certificate and examined it closely. "What about the ransom note? If we claim Julian drowned, we can't also claim he was kidnapped." "We destroy the note," Silas said. "We say we never received it. As far as anyone knows, Julian went for a walk and fell." Isabel nodded slowly. "All right, let's do it." Julian had heard enough. He stood, his legs unsteady, and walked to the steel door. He checked his watch. 3:45. 15 minutes until the wedding was supposed to start. It was time to end this. Julian entered the ballroom at exactly 4 p.m. The room fell silent. 200 guests turned to stare as he walked down the center aisle, still wearing the clothes he had been in the night before. Dark trousers, a white shirt, no tie. His hair was disheveled, his face unshaven. But his eyes were clear and hard. Isabel stood at the front of the room, next to the officiant, wearing a white Vera Wang gown that cost more than most people made in a year. Her face went pale as she saw him. Reed and Silas were standing near the bar, champagne glasses in hand. Reed's glass slipped from his fingers and shattered on the marble floor. Julian stopped in the center of the room and looked around. Senators, CEOs, family members, they were all watching him. Confusion and shock written on their faces. "Ladies and gentlemen," Julian said, his voice carrying across the room, "thank you for coming. I apologize for the delay. There's been a slight change of plans." He turned to face Isabel. "The wedding is cancelled." Isabel's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Julian reached into his pocket and pulled out a USB drive. He held it up so everyone could see. "This contains recordings of conversations between my brothers and my fiancée," he said. "Conversations in which they discuss embezzling $67 million from Hargrove Shipping. Conversations in which they plan my murder." The room erupted in whispers. Julian walked to the front of the room and handed the USB drive to a man standing near the door, a man in a dark suit who had been watching the proceedings with quiet interest. The man was Special Agent Marcus Holland of the FBI, and he had been waiting outside the estate for the last 3 hours, ready to move on Julian's signal. "Agent Holland," Julian said, "I believe you'll find everything you need on that drive." Holland took the USB drive and nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Hargrove." He gestured to 2 other agents who had entered the room behind Julian. They moved quickly, crossing to where Reed and Silas stood frozen. "Reed Hargrove, Silas Hargrove," Holland said, "you're under arrest for embezzlement and conspiracy to commit fraud." Reed's face crumpled. Silas did not move, did not speak, as the agents cuffed his hands behind his back. Julian turned to Isabel. She was still standing at the altar, her face white as chalk. "As for you," Julian said, "I suggest you contact your lawyer. The prenuptial agreement is void, which means you won't be seeing a penny of my money. And if the FBI finds any evidence that you were directly involved in the embezzlement or the conspiracy, you'll be joining my brothers." Isabel's composure finally broke. "Julian, please, get out," Julian said quietly. She stared at him for a long moment, and then she turned and walked out of the ballroom, her heels clicking against the marble. The room was silent, except for the sound of the agents leading Reed and Silas out in handcuffs. Julian stood alone at the front of the room, facing 200 stunned guests. He took a breath and addressed them. "I apologize for the disruption," he said. "I know many of you traveled a long way to be here today, but I couldn't let this wedding happen. Not when it was built on lies." He paused, looking around the room. "My brothers stole from me. My fiancée conspired against me, and I spent the last 24 hours believing that the people I loved most in the world wanted me dead." His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it, a rawness that he could not quite hide. "I staged my own disappearance to test their loyalty," he said, "and I learned the truth. Blood is not thicker than water. Blood is just another transaction. And in my family, loyalty has a price." He turned and walked out of the ballroom, leaving the guests behind. 3 months later, Julian sat in the library of the Newport estate, a glass of scotch in his hand. The trials were ongoing. Reed had taken a plea deal and was facing 7 years in federal prison. Silas had refused to cooperate and was looking at 15. Isabel had been charged as a co-conspirator, but her lawyers were working on a deal that would keep her out of prison in exchange for testimony. Julian did not care what happened to any of them. He had already moved on. Hargrove Shipping was thriving. With Reed and Silas gone, Julian had restructured the company, bringing in new leadership and cutting ties with the Ashcroft family. The merger was dead, but Julian had negotiated a partnership with a logistics firm in Singapore that more than made up for the lost revenue. The $67 million his brothers had stolen was back in the company accounts, and Julian had used it to expand the fleet and open new shipping routes in Southeast Asia. By every measure, he had won. He had saved his company, exposed his enemies, and secured his legacy. But he was alone. His brothers were in prison. His fiancée was gone, and his mother, who had flown in from her villa in Capri for the wedding, had looked at him with cold, disappointed eyes and said, "You've destroyed this family, Julian. I hope it was worth it." He had not spoken to her since. Julian set the glass down and stood. The library was silent, except for the ticking of the grandfather clock. Outside, the ocean was calm, the waves lapping gently against the cliffs. He walked to the window and looked out at the water. The estate felt larger than it had before, emptier. Every room was filled with the ghosts of people who were no longer there. He had spent his entire life preparing to run this company, to carry on the Hargrove legacy. And now that he had it, now that he had everything, he realized how little it meant. The throne was his, but it was a lonely place. Julian turned away from the window and walked out of the library. He climbed the grand staircase to the second floor and entered his bedroom. The room was dark, the curtains drawn. He sat down on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall. And in the drawer of his nightstand was the ring he had planned to give Isabel, the 22-carat diamond that had belonged to his grandmother. He had not looked at it since the day of the wedding. He opened the drawer and took out the ring. It felt heavy in his hand, cold and lifeless. Julian stood and walked to the window. He opened the curtains and looked out at the ocean. The sun was setting, casting the water in shades of gold and red. He held the ring up to the light, watching the diamond catch the fading sun. Then, without hesitation, he opened the window and threw the ring as far as he could. It arced through the air and disappeared into the ocean below. Julian closed the window and turned back to the empty room. He had won, but the victory tasted like ashes. The throne is a lonely place when you've had to bury your own blood to keep it. If you enjoyed this journey into the mind of a billionaire, make sure to subscribe, like the video, and comment below on what you would have done in his shoes.